more details and referred him to the Rossums for more information. Constance Rossum told Greg's boss that he had been experiencing flu-like symptoms over the weekend and had mixed cough syrup with prescription drugs, causing an adverse allergic reaction, resulting in his death. That explanation sounded odd to the doctor, who not only held a PhD in forensics, but was also a medical doctor. He believed an allergic reaction would have occurred right away and not 2 days later. Something didn't feel right to him, and it hadn't felt right to him all day. Greg's brother Jerome felt the exact same way as Greg's boss. The things just weren't adding up, and the shifting stories weren't helping with his unease. Jerome recalled Greg recently declining to take an antihistamine their mother had offered him for a stuffy nose. Greg was always very anti-drug. Jerome was determined to find out just what had happened to his brother and why. He wasn't ready to call his brother's death a suicide, an accidental overdose, or an adverse allergic reaction. Jerome thought that this was murder, and he set out to prove it.
The next morning, Dr. Robertson informed the office that Kristen Rossum's husband had committed suicide by taking an overdose of drugs. At that morning's meeting, with the Chief Deputy Medical Examiner and Chief Investigators, Dr. Robertson was presented with investigator Angie Wagner's official report on Greg DeViller's death. It was determined, in accordance with office protocol involving the death of an employee or family member, that the autopsy would be conducted at UCSD Medical Center, and the toxicology would be performed in-house by the chief toxicologist, who happened to be Dr. Robertson. After the meeting, Lloyd Amborn, who recalled the persistent rumors of an improper relationship between Kristen and Dr. Robertson, decided to take special measures surrounding Greg's death to avoid any appearance of impropriety, and for the first time ever in office history, he would send all of Greg's toxicology work to an outside agency. Then he called Dr. Robertson into his office to inform him about his decision. He made it abundantly clear that Dr. Robertson was to have nothing to do with any of the specimens from Greg DeViller's autopsy. Then Amborn contacted Frank Barnhart at the Sheriff's Department Crime Lab, and he agreed to store Greg's toxicology samples off-site until they could be sent out for independent analysis. He then made one final call to the San Diego medical examiner, Brian Blackburn, informing him of Greg's death. Meanwhile, Jerome DeVillers had started his own personal investigation. The day before, when Kristen's brother Brent suggested her friend Dr. Robertson stay with her at the apartment, she loudly and nervously stated that that would be inappropriate. Her animated response set off alarm bells for Jerome. Prepared with a pocket tape recorder, he went to Kristen's apartment a few days later and was surprised to find her there with her boss, Dr. Robertson. Sobbing, she told him Greg had taken all of her oxycodone and clonazepam. She said Greg was upset by a letter he found from her old boyfriend. When Jerome stated he didn't believe Greg would kill himself, she quickly agreed, saying she thought it was an accidental overdose. Well aware of her past drug problems, he was highly suspicious of Kristen's story. Her emotions seemed forced and contrived, and she wasn't making much sense. Next, Jerome went over to Greg's office and had a conversation with his boss. When he shared that Greg's death was being labeled as suicide, his boss strongly disagreed. Dr. Stefan Grenwald showed some emails that he found on Greg's computer between Greg and Kristen. In them, Kristen communicates to Greg about his lack of trust in her and his accusations of an affair with her boss, Dr. Robertson, and he alleged drug relapse. When Jerome mentioned Kristen planned on having Greg cremated, Dr. Grenwell stated they couldn't allow that to happen. He insisted there needed to be an independent autopsy and tox screen performed. During the internal autopsy examination, Dr. Blackburn noticed Greg's lungs were 3 times heavier than normal, pointing to congestion. This indicated Greg would have been unconscious and comatose for at least 6 to 12 hours prior to his death. The pathologist also found signs of early pneumonia, meaning that Greg had been unable to breathe properly and clear his lungs. Greg's bladder was almost bursting with 550 millimeters of urine, which meant Greg had not been able to relieve himself for at least 10 hours prior to his death. Factoring the condition of the lungs and bladder together, Dr. Blackburn would later testify that Greg had probably been lying in bed unconscious from 7 a.m. Monday morning until 9:30 p.m. that same evening when Kristen called 911. Negating her assertions, she spoke with him throughout the day and even fed him soup. He also noted there were 3 puncture marks on his left arm, although there were resuscitation attempts. Dr. Blackburn also took tissue and blood specimens for further laboratory testing. These were taken back to the medical examiner's office for later transport to the sheriff's office a few days later. He requested the samples be tested for alcohol, drugs of abuse, and a urine drug screen. He did not ask for a fentanyl test, as this was not office protocol. Dr. Blackburn informed Jerome that Greg had died of a drug overdose. When Jerome told him his brother detested drugs, Dr. Blackburn mentioned the rumors of an improper relationship between Kristen and her boss, Dr. Robertson, who were both employed at the medical examiner's office. Dr. Blackburn had just given Jerome a motive for Kristen to kill Greg.
In an effort to stop the cremation, Jerome called the San Diego Police Department and asked to speak with a homicide detective on duty. That would turn out to be Detective Lori Agnew, a 23-year veteran. She listened carefully to Jerome's concerns that campus police had labeled his brother's death a suicide and that his body would soon be cremated. Back at the medical examiner's office, toxicologist Donald Lowe contacted campus police detective Sergeant Robert Jones with important information regarding the death of Greg. He told them that Kristen and Dr. Robertson were having an affair and that he felt that information was needed before declaring his death a suicide. Detective Jones recalled Dr. Robertson waiting outside Kristen's apartment for 2 hours on the night of Greg's death. After this call, he decided the matter should be handed over to the San Diego homicide for further investigation. He then called Detective Agnew, informing her about Kristen's affair with her boss at the medical examiner's office. Already armed with this information from her discussion with Jerome, she asked her supervisor to place a hold on Greg's body and stop the cremation. Detective Agnew officially opened up a homicide investigation into the death of Greg DeVillers. Greg's boss, having not been interviewed by anyone except Jerome, took it upon himself to send a letter to the San Diego homicide detectives explaining why Greg may not have committed suicide. It began, "Dear homicide detectives, this statement is to express our strong belief that Gregory, who was our friend and co-worker for many years, has not shown any signs of suicidal tendency during all the time we have known him." This letter went on to describe Greg as a happy and ambitious person with exciting plans for the future. They also asked for an opportunity to offer evidence from Greg's computer and to discuss the matter with San Diego homicide detectives. 7 of Greg's co-workers signed the letter. After a memorial service held for Greg on November 12th, Jerome went back to Kristen and Greg's apartment and was stunned to find that Kristen had removed any and all trace of Greg. All of Greg's possessions were gone, including the framed wedding pictures that had adorned the walls just weeks before. The following week, the preliminary toxicology results were in, and they were astonishing. The comprehensive drug screen came back positive for the obscure but lethal drug fentanyl. The sheriff's crime lab called Dr. Blackburn with the news, who in turn informed Dr. Robertson's boss. Robertson was immediately ordered to break off all contact with Kristen without being told why. Frank Barnhart, Kristen's friend from the sheriff's crime lab, was determined to find out how Greg died. On his own initiative, he asked Pacific Laboratories to retest all specimens. He also sent out additional specimens to 2 other specialty labs, one in Las Vegas and one in Canada. He instructed them to spare no expense and do whatever testing was needed to confirm or disprove fentanyl and then measure the quantities in which it occurred. It was something that he had never done before in his long career. That same week, Kristen made several trips to Tijuana to buy meth from a taxi driver. Now on bereavement leave, she spent her days getting high at home and her nights with Dr. Robertson. Neither one of them were aware that they were both being investigated by the Homicide Task Force. They believed they were free to pursue their relationship. Toxicologist Kathy Ham happened to be using Dr. Robertson's phone when she looked in his desk for a blank sheet of paper. In a drawer, she found a 2-page handwritten love letter to Kristen, complaining that he would be spending Thanksgiving and Christmas without her because of Greg. It would be forever referred to as the, quote, "Hi Gorgeous" letter. She showed it to coworker Donald Lowe, and together they decided it was an important piece of evidence and faxed it to Detective Lori Agnew.
In December, Kristen was asked to come into the homicide department to discuss Greg's death with detectives Agnew and Valle. She was told she could leave at any time. Kristen asked if it was normal for campus police to pass off cases to homicide, even in the cases of suicide. Detective Agnew explained that campus officers weren't equipped to conduct investigations and were merely fact gatherers. Kristen explained that Greg was her saving angel and her best friend. She bounced back and forth between Greg being an amazing person and a scary, angry person who wouldn't give her space or allow her to grow as a person. She said that because he helped her to get off drugs, he felt he owned her. She went on to say that Greg's family were horrible and stupid, and all angry people, especially Jerome. She believes something was seriously wrong with Jerome, and that he just refused to believe Greg had any problems. She called Greg vindictive and revengeful, and told him how Greg had threatened to tell her superiors that she was having an affair with her boss and had a prior history of drug abuse. When asked why she wanted a separation, she admitted she had mutual feelings for Dr. Robertson, and he was an amazing man with all of the perfect qualities she was looking for in a person. She called him a great friend. Towards the end of the 3-hour interview, she was presented with the Hi Gorgeous letter, which strongly suggested a physical relationship. Kristen was stunned into silence. Detective Agnew bluntly stated, "We have a healthy individual who didn't like drugs, who helped you get off drugs, and has died in a bizarre manner surrounded by rose petals and a wedding picture. We have a lot of people who think you and Dr. Robertson had something to do with his death. We have 2 people who wanted out of a marriage, who wanted to be together, and we have a dead man who could have, at the very least, derailed some careers. You work at the medical examiner's office and have plenty of access to drugs and could have slipped him something. Did you have anything to do with Greg's death?" Kristen stated she found the line of question disgusting and not something she would ever consider doing.
A few days later, Detective Agnew and Valle met with Dr. Robertson. Backing up Kristen's account, Robertson said he'd sent Kristen home several times on the day of Greg's death to check on her husband. He said he suspected Greg's death was drug-related because Kristen had admitted he had taken large amounts of, quote, unknown medications, unquote. He shared Kristen's opinion that Greg was a, quote, volatile type of individual, unquote, who was prone to outbursts and unpredictable behavior. Dr. Robertson answered many questions with a nonverbal nodding of his head in agreement, as if processing the information. He would not admit to anything other than a fondness for Kristen. He admitted to telling Kristen that if his wife and he were to separate again, he would certainly look to pursue a relationship with her, but only if she were separating too. He stated after Greg warned him to stay away from Kristen, he decided to refocus on his relationship with his own wife. He admitted to knowing about Kristen's past relationship with drugs and her subsequent recent relapse. He said he was disappointed and deeply saddened for her. However, he made a personal decision not to tell the medical examiner's office that she was back on drugs, despite his legal and ethical requirement to do so. He stated he didn't think Kristen had anything to do with her husband's death, describing her as sweet, caring, and loving. Dr. Robertson ended the interview by saying he wasn't sure whether or not Greg's death was a scare tactic that went wrong or if it was an intentional overdose. Back at the medical examiner's office, they had been checking the database for all cases where fentanyl had been impounded at death scenes in the year 2000. It was discovered that there were 15 missing fentanyl patches from the 24 that should have been logged in by Kristen. There was also an additional 10 milligram vial of fentanyl citrate missing, which Kristen had logged into inventory on October 3, 1997. When Detective Agnew found out just how much fentanyl was missing, they commissioned a drug audit for the entire office.
In December, Kristen and Dr. Robertson were both fired from their positions in the medical examiner's office. The official cause for Dr. Robertson's termination was described as a key personal issue with serious operational implications. Kristen was fired for breaking her probationary status by using illegal drugs. The medical examiner's office then audited 8 death cases involving methamphetamine. Of the 8, 7 of them had all of the evidence completely missing. Of those 7, Kristen Rosum logged them all in.
At 7 a.m. on January 4, 2001, simultaneous search warrants were served on both Kristen and Dr. Robertson. Detective Agnew placed Kristen under arrest after discovering she was in possession of illegal narcotics. After being arrested and booked, Kristen called Dr. Robertson asking to be bailed out. He said he couldn't as he was in the middle of having his apartment searched. He then immediately called his lawyer, Charles Goldberg, explaining his computers were seized and his passport taken. Later, investigators would find 37 presentations and articles on fentanyl on Dr. Robertson's computer. After the police left Robertson's apartment, he walked down to a dumpster and discarded a bag full of items from the SOFT conference, including love letters, cards, poetry, and a book on sex. However, the surveillance team managed to retrieve it. The next day, Kristen was released from custody and had to tell her parents that she'd relapsed on drugs and engaged in an extramarital affair with Dr. Robertson. She said it was because they'd forced her into a marriage she didn't want. In Kristen's mind, it was her parents' fault, it was Greg's fault, and Jerome's fault. On July 9, 2001, Dr. Robertson, along with his lawyer, insisted on a second meeting with homicide detectives. Mr. Goldberg explained that Dr. Robertson wanted his computers and passport returned and would not be discussing anything regarding his relationship with Kristen after Greg's death. He explained that it was a sore point and had caused him a lot of problems in his marriage. Dr. Robertson admitted to knowing that the San Diego Medical Examiner's Office didn't routinely test for fentanyl in an autopsy. However, he refused to discuss anything regarding how Greg might have been injected with fentanyl or how much fentanyl might have been lethal. Then, Dr. Robertson was confronted with the evidence he discarded in the dumpster, and when asked why he tried to dispose of them, he stated he was trying to reconcile with his wife and didn't want them in the house. He told detectives that he had ended his relationship with Kristen and told her that he didn't want any further contact. When asked why he requested the meeting, he said he just wanted to get his things back because, quote, I'm losing my wife. I don't want to be any part of this. I had a relationship with Kristen, but this isn't where I envisioned my life beginning at 2001, in the middle of a homicide investigation. I want it over and done with, unquote. When he asked if his computers could be returned due to 2 upcoming conferences, his request was denied. They said that they had yet to be examined and they could become trial evidence. A few months later, Kristen had stopped doing drugs, had been hired by a new company, and was starting to make new friends. Her relationship with Dr. Robertson continued. This time, Dr. Robertson was careful with his love letters and presents to Kristen, mailing them to her new place of work instead of her apartment. In contrast, Kristen wasn't trying to be discreet at all. She placed pictures of herself and Robertson at her desk and talked of marrying him and having kids together someday. Unable to find a job, Dr. Robertson returned to Australia, reportedly for his mother's cancer diagnosis. Kristen was heartbroken and confided in her boss and coworkers. However, Kristen quickly found a new boyfriend and was trying to put the homicide investigation behind her. In the meantime, computer forensic experts worked for months to reconstruct the daily interactions on the computers of Kristen, Greg, and Dr. Robertson.
When Kristen was asked to come in for a second interview and polygraph test, she hired San Diego attorney Michael Panzer. On the advice of her new attorney, Kristen stopped communicating with Detective Agnew. On June 25th, after her attorney had called her to let her know an arrest warrant was being issued, she headed to her job and asked her coworker to hide her love letters and pictures of Dr. Robertson. Half an hour later, Kristen was arrested at her apartment and transferred to the Las Colinas Women's Detention Facility, where she was booked, fingerprinted, and photographed.
The next day, when 24-year-old Kristen appeared in court in an orange jumpsuit, the courtroom gallery was packed with reporters. The media circus surrounding this case had just begun. Outside the courthouse, Professor Rossum gave his first interview to reporters, calling the charges against Kristen devastating. Jerome de Villers also spoke to reporters that day, saying his late brother knew that Kristen had a problem with drugs before they were married and believed he was rescuing her. He ended by saying he was looking forward to the truth coming out. By now, the story was gathering momentum in the press and had gone national. One photo editor would later call Kristen the most beautiful potential murderess in living memory. By the weekend, the story had gone international and was covered extensively in Australia's press. The focus was mostly on the affair between Kristen and the dashing Dr. Robertson. Meanwhile, after Kristen entered her not guilty plea before Judge M. Thompson, her bail request was denied. Her parents said she didn't have the financial means for a lawyer, as they were doing all they could to raise the bail money in the event it was granted in the future. The judge appointed Kristen 2 experienced public defenders. The Rossums set out on a public relations tour, pleading their daughter's innocence to the hostile press. The Rossum family agreed to be on a special ABC Good Morning America segment featuring the case. Professor Rossum described his daughter's drug addiction and adulterous affair with her boss as disappointing examples of moral weakness. On the other side of the world, Dr. Robertson gave his first interview, denying reports he fled to escape prosecution, proclaimed his innocence, saying he returned to Australia to care for his mother, who was ill with cancer. While the Rossums were engaged in their media tour on behalf of their daughter, the de Villers family hired a lawyer to file a wrongful death suit against the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office and Kristen Rossum and Dr. Robertson for the wrongful death of Greg de Villers. The medical examiner's office was accused of negligence in hiring Rossum without first running background checks and placing her in charge of dangerous street drugs. They also claimed the office should have prevented Kristen from donating Greg's organs so a proper autopsy could have been conducted. In the press, the Rossums started disparaging Greg as someone who had been spiraling out of control and exhibiting questionable behavior. Dr. Rossum stated the staged death scene was Greg telling Kristen, not in a letter but symbolically, that the romance that could be embodied in a single rose was now over, insisting that Greg had committed suicide when he realized he could no longer keep Kristen under his control. The Rossums embarked on a daily interview schedule as they wanted the truth to be known.
This case was quickly becoming San Diego's highest profile case, making front-page headlines almost daily. Public defenders Alex Lobeg and Victor Erickson had been assigned to Kristen's case. However, they found themselves in the unfortunate position of fielding media inquiries rather than working on Kristen's vigorous defense.
Judge John Thompson denied the prosecutor's request to allow cameras into the courtroom for the preliminary hearing. The first to testify at the hearing was campus police officer Bob Jones, who described the scene on the night that Greg died. He stated the investigation changed from suicide to homicide after toxicologist Donald Lowe tipped him off that Rossum and her boss were having an affair, which prompted him to turn the case over to Detective Agnew. Next to testify was paramedic Sean Jordan, who described finding Kristen in the living room on a cordless phone to 911 operators while pretending to administer CPR. He then went on to describe the scene, Greg's condition, Kristen's demeanor, and also what life-saving measures had been taken in the attempt to save Greg's life. Next, Jerome testified, giving the history of how Greg and Kristen had met, describing Greg's positive demeanor 2 weeks prior to their last meeting, and their future plans to go snowboarding together.
During the lunch break, Professor Rossum gave an impromptu interview to reporters, describing the case against Kristen as a house of cards that would soon come crashing down.
Jerome's tapes of his meeting with Kristen were both played in court in their entirety. As the tapes played, Kristen broke down in tears. Next, various apartment complex witnesses testified to Kristen's repeated and frantic returns to the apartment throughout the day of Greg's death. Then, Dr. Stefan Grunwald also testified, describing Greg as a rational problem solver with big future plans. He said Greg was popular and without enemies. He stated that the day Greg didn't show up for work on November 6th, he immediately became worried and began telephoning him. He and others in his office had an odd feeling that something was wrong. He testified Kristen finally answered at 9:30 p.m., telling him the paramedics were trying to save Greg's life. Then toxicologist Donald Lowe testified. Lowe was the man who was given Dr. Robertson's position after he was fired. Lowe began testifying about the lab's recent drug audit and which drugs were missing, which he listed as a large quantity of fentanyl patches, 1 vial of fentanyl, methamphetamine, and oxycodone, and clonazepam, which were all found in Greg's autopsy results. Dr. Lowe also testified to the medical examiner's careless office procedures at the time of logging drug evidence. He stated it was easy for someone to reach into the destruction box and retrieve drugs even when the box had been locked. He also stated that the 2001 audit was the first he was aware of in his 32 years at the office. Dr. Blackburn, the chief medical examiner, testified on his findings during Greg's autopsy. He confirmed the cause of death was later determined to be from acute fentanyl intoxication. He explained the 2 ways to administer it, which is either by skin patch or intravenously. He explained the levels in Greg's body were excessively high and could have killed him many times over. Additionally, clonazepam and oxycodone were also found in his body.
Detective Agnew testified she first became involved in the case after meeting with Jerome DeVillers. After hearing that Kristen and her alleged lover, Dr. Robertson, both worked at the medical examiner's office, she put a hold on Greg's cremation and took over the investigation from campus police.
While Mr. Rossum was on the stand, he stated that he had photographic evidence to prove that Greg had obtained the fentanyl that had killed him. He said his daughter Kristen had provided him with a picture to prove that Greg had obtained the fentanyl from his own father's medical supplies, which were kept in storage in Thousand Oaks. A week before his death, Greg and Kristen had gone to the storage locker to photograph Dr. DeVillers' medical equipment, hoping to sell it on eBay. Kristen told her father that 1 box contained fentanyl patches, and Greg had said he would dispose of them himself. It was the last time Kristen saw the box. Mr. Rossum had no idea how Greg had self-administered the lethal drug without leaving behind any evidence. When asked why this had never come up before, he said he had been waiting for the appropriate time to share the information. He further said that he and his wife would often visit Greg and Kristen on weekends, and that Greg would regularly spend the entire weekend in bed, taking over-the-counter medications on a regular basis. He said for someone who was allegedly healthy and outdoorsy, he was also often very sickly. When asked about his daughter's drug use, he said she had never been arrested or charged despite her 1994 possession charge. He stated his daughter hadn't taken drugs since 1995 until her recent relapse before Greg's death, which had been caused, he said, by the stress that Greg had been putting Kristen through.
To Kristen's surprise, she would be heading to trial for first-degree murder of her husband Greg DeVillers. On January 4th, 2002, after 6 months of incarceration, Kristen Rossum was released on $1.25 million bail into her parents' custody. 2 weeks after her release, Judge Thompson placed Kristen, the attorneys, and the investigators involved in the case on a gag order, accusing the Rossums of attempting to poison the jury pool. An interview taped before the gag order was issued aired from jail with a sobbing Kristen telling a reporter she did not harm her husband and thought Greg vindictively killed himself in order to frame her and Dr. Robertson for his murder. Dr. Robertson gave an interview from Australia, appearing to turn on his former lover. He stated that if Greg had injected himself with the massive doses of fentanyl allegedly found in his body, he would never have lived long enough to hide or dispose of it. He agreed it absolutely looked suspicious. One day after it aired, Judge Thompson sealed all pretrial documents to prevent further contamination of an already polluted jury pool.
The DA's paralegal was working full-time on the case when, on a hunch, she subpoenaed Kristen's discount grocery card records from the day of Greg's death. It was discovered that Kristen had purchased a can of soup, a cough syrup, and a single rose. Later, the defense would describe this key piece of evidence as, quote, devastating to their case. The day Kristen was supposed to meet with her defense team to discuss this new piece of evidence, she called 911 complaining she was having a panic attack. Paramedics arrived and found her face down on a bed, clutching a teddy bear, sobbing. After the jury was selected, the 12 jurors and 4 alternates saw Kristen break into tears for the first of many times throughout the trial. The prosecution began their opening statement with a simple outline of the case, stating that Kristen had murdered her husband because of her addiction to meth and her love for her former boss. The prosecutor stated that although they would never see her former boss, Dr. Robertson, he would be an integral part of the trial and was an unindicated co-conspirator. They also said there was a substantial amount of circumstantial evidence against him for a conspiracy to commit murder charge. The prosecutor likened the case to a murder mystery and stated it would be filled with, quote, sex, drugs, motives, and innuendos, but eventually they would put the pieces together. The circumstantial evidence with Kristen's lies told in the cover-up would finally intersect in a guilty verdict for Kristen Rossum. Throughout the prosecutor's opening